Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this meeting hosted by the Ottawa Peace Council and the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians, and from now on it'll be referred to as AUUC, much shorter. My name is Vera Sachuk, and I'm president of the Ottawa branch of the AUC. The AUC is actually a century-old organization founded in 1918 by Ukrainian immigrants who felt the need for a progressive perspective and cultural involvement in their new country. Originally, it was named the Ukrainian Canadian Labour Temple Association. Then it went through quite a few name changes to become the AUC in 1946. Over the years, this organization has built halls across our country, sponsored not only groups in Ukrainian dance and choirs, orchestra, and drama, but also published newspapers and books. Its members have been active in promoting labor rights, fighting poverty, and activating for world peace and disarmament. In fact, the AUC was a founding member of the Canadian Peace Congress back in 1950. A major development in our history was the organization of the Workers' Benevolent Association, a fraternal to help those in need. It offered life insurance plans, hospital coverage, and mortgages at rates more affordable than those of large corporate firms. Another highlight was the designation of our mother hall, the Ukrainian Labour Temple in Winnipeg, as a National Historic Site. It is a well-known building used by many outside groups for meetings and banquets. Glenn reminisced that this building was also a stop on any tour about the historic Winnipeg General Strike in 1919, so it's commonly used. Over the years, AUC has held several national festivals, gathering a few hundred performers from across the country in our major cities. No other Ukrainian organization has accomplished this. It's truly a national organization that has enriched the lives of members culturally and politically. In my personal view, it's been instrumental in shaping my worldviews as well as providing a venue for lifelong friendships and involvement since my teen years. If you want more information, we do have a website. Just click on AUC. Now to Glenn. I'm honored to introduce the national president of our AUC, our guest speaker today. He's a Winnipegger who wears many hats. He's president of the Winnipeg AUC branch. He's our national president, of course, and he's president of Peace Alliance in Winnipeg. He rose through the trade union movement, beginning in 1979 as a machinist with CP Rail. He quickly became active in the trade union movement, holding leadership positions locally and nationally for the entire time of his working life. Since 1979, he's been active in the peace and anti-war movement in an organization called the People's Front. And he was actually in a demonstration calling for the banning of cruise missile testing years ago. And that takes a few of us well into the past. Some of you are too young for that. Glenn has been invited to speak on the war in Ukraine in forums such as those in the World Beyond War website, and he was invited by the St. Catharines City Council, who was interested in hearing another point of view. He has spoken on this issue in many forums. And so now may I call on Glenn Michalchuk.
Well, thank you, Larry. Thank you, Vera. Thank you, Jenny, for your remarks. Thank you to the Ottawa Peace Council for inviting me to come here. And actually, in the short time I've been here, it's been a wonderful experience. Thank you to the Ottawa branch, and I hope to have some further discussions with the Ottawa branch about our work as the AUUC. And as the poster said, and the title slide says, the war in Ukraine, a discussion about its cause, and the need for a ceasefire and negotiated peace. It's odd that we have to have such a discussion, but such a discussion, this war has been going on for almost 2 years. And the discussion has decidedly not been about these questions of ceasefire and negotiated peace. The discussion has centered very much around the need to prolong the war, to escalate the war, and so on, at great consequences for the people of Ukraine. And I'm very glad to be here on the part of a progressive association of Ukrainian Canadians, the AUUC, which has taken a stand both before the war that the war could be averted, and once the war broke out and Russia invaded, that the imperative was to end that war through discussion, through diplomacy, through negotiations. But unfortunately, both before and after, the response has been one to turn really a deaf ear to that. And I'm talking not about people, but I'm talking about our governments and our other elected MPs who shamelessly have remained silent on the question of this war, or have been silenced on the question of this war, which is another aspect of it. So it's a very broad topic to discuss, and it's not going to be possible to discuss and touch on all the questions, but nonetheless, we shall try. So I think it is important to hear a perspective from progressive Ukrainians or other Ukrainians who have not involved themselves in this war psychosis for various reasons about Ukraine, for various reasons, and that will become part of my presentation as we go into it. So it's very important to hear these views. So let me just begin a little bit about, and you've heard a little bit from Vera about myself, but I'm also chair of Peace Alliance Winnipeg. And Peace Alliance Winnipeg is a broad-based anti-war peace organization which has a long history in Winnipeg, representing on the issue of peace, opposition to war, the struggle for First Nations rights, human rights, and the issue of the democratic rights of Canadians. We've had the opportunity in our work to host the former British MP, George Galloway, on the issue of Palestine, still a very much relevant question today. Elizabeth May, the Green Party, on the questions of the inadequacies of the first past the post electoral system in Canada, and Dennis Edney, the lawyer who won the release of Omar Khadr from the US prison at Guantanamo Bay. This is just some of the opportunities of the type of people we've had to work with in the Peace Alliance. And if you're interested, some of these talks are recorded and are available at the YouTube website of the Peace Alliance. They actually all are recorded, just in the, not everything has been uploaded to that site. And as Vera said, my own history in the peace and anti-war movement goes back to that period of the testing of the cruise missile and Canadian opposition to it. And one of my first, in terms of the Palestinian issues, I remember in the 1980s, in the early 1980s, I was already working at CP Rail, but demonstrating against the massacre of the Palestinian people in the refugee camps at Shatila and Sabra, which is identical to what's going on today in Gaza. As for the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians, it's the oldest mass secular organization of Ukrainian Canadians. And it was formed in 1918 as Vera said, as the Ukrainian Labor Temple Association, after several years of organizing by the new and large Ukrainian immigrant community to Canada. And they formed the first wave of Ukrainian immigration to Canada. It was formed out of the progressive social and political movement that characterized the politics in the regions encompassed by the then Austro-Hungarian Empire and Tsarist Russia. So before Ukraine was established, which came out of the fall of those empires after World War I. I was elected national president at the AUUC National Convention in October 2022, replacing President Bob Sajek, who announced his retirement at that time, and I'm happy to have Bob here. Significantly, the AUUC took the position that war could be averted as tensions between Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and the US rose in late 2021 and early 2022, in January, February. The AUUC at that time called for de-escalation and diplomacy to reduce the military tensions that were rising between Ukraine and Russia as a result of the conflict in East Ukraine, which was the civil war that had been raging since 2014, and the escalation of that conflict. So, excuse me, while the AUC had that position, did you take that? While the AUC raised that position, that was not the position that was being discussed in Parliament, in the Canadian Parliament at that time, or in various capitals of the Western countries. In the Canadian Parliament, what was being discussed at that time was this whole Cold War ideology of confrontation with Russia. And if you go back, and it's public record, you can read the Hansard debate of the Take Note debate in Parliament at the end of January, and it is all about confrontation with Russia. It's entirely Cold War debate, based on Canada's historical position vis-a-vis Russia, as seeing Russia as an enemy of the Canadian people, going back to Cold War days, going back to the Soviet Union, and so on. So that was the entire tenor of the discussion in Canada. It was impossible to actually talk to anyone about having a question that Canada should be urging a de-escalation. And we will explain that there was actually ways to solve the war in Ukraine, the civil war. In fact, and I'll just make another brief aside, at the end of January, Liberal MPs in the Prairie provinces organized a forum in conjunction with the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, and Melanie Joly about how Canada should support Ukraine. That meeting was organized by Liberal MPs, as I said, in Western Canada, and representatives of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Myself and others were able to go on to that forum. It was a very closed forum. It was very much constricted in terms of how you could participate. But the entire message out of that forum was, as Chrystia Freeland put it, a confrontation between democracy and authoritarianism. And that really frames the whole discussion that was to take place, not only in the Canadian Parliament, but in the general discourse that was going on, and the big reasons that we stumbled into this war. And again, just going back to the Hansard of that period, during the Take Note debate, there were some MPs who said, you know, I'm being pressured to take a stand on this, but I'd really like to know more. A few. But that didn't happen. They were being pressured they said they were receiving constant phone calls from representatives of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress about why military involvement with Ukraine was the only possible solution. So the position of the AUUC was not unique to it. And in fact, in the period of January-February 2022, the call for de-escalation and diplomacy was heard around the world as tensions mounted, including from Ukraine. Most significantly, this was the desire of the people in Ukraine. And in fact, Zelensky was in those months, in January especially, was often said that, you know, we have to avert this war, we have to do something, we have to try something. So it was not just that the people of Ukraine were amping up for war, they were very concerned about it. In Canada, peace organizations began to sound the alarm over the increasing warmongering tone of the Canadian government, and a section of the Ukrainian diaspora, represented by the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, who stumped for confrontation with Russia. And in fact, Ottawa Peace Council, along with a host of Canadian peace organizations, including the Peace Alliance Winnipeg, signed on to this call in January 2022, national call to the Trudeau government to de-escalate conflict between Russia and NATO over Ukraine. Canada must stop arming Ukraine, end Operation Unifer and Operation Reassurance, the two operations that were being directed by the Canadian government to closely integrate Ukraine and making it capable of operating within NATO, and withdraw all armed forces from Eastern Europe. That statement was signed on in January 22. Why opposing and ending this war is the right thing to do. And the quote there is from the AUUC National Statement of April 5th, 2023. No matter how one characterizes the war, the imperative is to end it. More than 12 months of conflict and the destruction and death it has caused speak to this necessity. This is critical for the peace, security, and for the future of Ukraine, and to end the dangers posed by the escalation to peace and security in Europe. In fact, a statement that was released by the Peace Alliance at that time said, This war is due to a failure to bring peace and security in the aftermath of the Cold War. It is a repeat of what happened at the end of World War II, when the opportunity for peace and security in Europe was squandered with the creation of a NATO military alliance, which was followed in turn by the creation of the Warsaw Pact. So we have a situation that arose in this period where this pushing forward of this conflict in Ukraine created a great opportunity for instability in Europe, as we have seen. But why did this happen? To end the war is not the goal of all. Indeed, the Western nations, or the collective West, as it is sometimes called, and others, look to prolong the war for their own ends. Thus, in April 2022, we saw the collapse of peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. The collapse of peace talks was welcomed by some who claimed that the war must proceed in order to create conditions for peace by defeating Russia on Ukrainian battlefields. More than 1 year of escalating war has proven this false. The attainment of peace is no closer due to the massive influx of military support Ukraine or the enormous casualties Ukraine has suffered. So this is this slide. This talks a little bit about the destruction and impact of the war. So according to the UNHCR, that's the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, as of May 2023, 5.1 million people have been displaced internally in Ukraine. 6.2 million refugees have been recorded globally. That's as of July 2023. 17.6 million in need of humanitarian assistance. War casualties estimated between 100,000 and 300,000 on the Ukrainian side. Some people will say these are false numbers, but actually last fall at this time, the Ukrainian government said, slipped, I think it might have been the defense minister, and he said that they suffered 100,000 casualties on the battlefield. If you listen to some of the American commentators on the war, and some of them even being right-wing commentators, like Colonel Douglas McGregor, who's an interesting person because of his military background and his close links with the U.S. state and his military connections. He places the numbers much higher, at almost 300,000, as do many others. So this is part of the enormous human cost. On the other side, Russia accounts, there's enormous crisis in energy supply for the world. Russia accounts for about a fifth of global trade in natural gas. Global energy prices have been rising since the onset of the war. In terms of food, Russia and Ukraine account for more than a quarter of global wheat exports and more than half of the world's total sunflower oil exports. Ukraine is the fourth largest exporter of corn. Russia is a major supplier of fertilizer ingredients. These things may or may not all directly impact on Canada, but they certainly impact on other areas of the globe, such as the global south, such as Africa, and so on. In terms of metals, Russia and Ukraine are global leaders in the export of metals, such as nickel, copper, iron, and titanium. Ukraine produces 90% of the semiconductor-grade neon, critical for the manufacture of chips and the machines that make the chips. The rising cost of living worldwide, Canada, before the war in 2020 was 0.7%. In 2021, 3.4%. In 2022, the first year of the war raging, 6.8%. And that was, by the way, a 40-year high. And 4.1% is what's estimated for 2023. Now, in addition to that, you note that part of this drive to make sure that Ukraine wins the war is to provide it with weapons such as depleted uranium. Now, depleted uranium, when it's used on the battlefield, poisons the environment and will do so for generations to come. That's the experience of the people in Iraq and other places where depleted uranium has been used. It's used in armor-piercing shells. And one of the reasons I've read that the reason they're using depleted uranium is because of the shortage of the material of titanium, which is used in shells. And of course, the war in Ukraine has consumed so many shells, artillery shells and other shells, that cannot no longer supply. NATO cannot have the means to provide the amount of ammunition that's needed for the war. The other thing that's been shipped to Ukraine in the interest of escalating its defensive capabilities is cluster munitions. Cluster munitions also remain in the environment generations after the war. People in Southeast Asia continue to experience the problems of cluster munitions. So these are going to condition the situation for Ukraine long after the war is ended. The war has impacted the global economy through the soaring prices of energy and food, as we've discussed, and including the breakdown of international bodies such as the G20. At this point, the war has been raging for 20 months. Much has changed over the course of that time. And by this I mean that we know about the politics which have driven the war and the emergence of various facts. We can look at this by events which characterized the period in the lead up to the war, those that followed in the month or so immediately following the war, and then those which have transpired as the war has dragged on. So of course, one of the things that has come to light is the fact, and Larry mentioned it, I think, that in his remarks, that there was a deal between Russia and Ukraine in April 2022, a signed deal. It came to light at the time. Most people tried to dismiss it, that it was quashed by NATO when Boris Johnson visited. But when the recent African delegation visited both Ukraine and Russia to present their proposals, they first visited Ukraine, and then they went to Russia, and they met directly with President Putin. He showed them the signed agreement that they had that was then torn up. So there are interesting parallels to the political positions of the U.S. vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine and the war which has broken out between Hamas and Israel. And I can just give an aside on that. In both, they're using a country to achieve geopolitical aims. So in the U.S., vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine, as the presentation will explain, the U.S. has seen it as the way to, if not constrain Russia, to actually destroy Russia. And in that sense, they've been prepared to use Ukraine as a proxy. Now, in the question of Israel and Hamas, the parallel which is drawn is the role that Israel plays in the Middle East and the role that that has played in denying the just considerations of the Palestinians for a solution to their question of the homeland. So in my view, it confirms that Ukraine is being used as a proxy in the striving of the U.S. to maintain its position as the dominant world power by trying to constrain other powers in the world, whether they be regional powers such as Iran or international powers such as Russia and China. And if you want to look at another parallel, you can look at what is happening in China versus Taiwan and how that conflict is being stirred up. After more than 75 years of dominating most of the world, its apparent success as the sole power setting world policy with the end of Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. now faces the fact that there are no other powers capable of contending with it regionally and internationally. Parallel to this is the emergence of countries setting their own agenda in terms of economic and political development. For example, the emergence and growth of BRICS groups of nations. So this is the general background as to why the confrontation was to happen in Ukraine. And Ukraine, of course, borders Russia. And how well do you see this slide? We weren't able to turn over the slide showing the NATO distribution of states as well. But the most significant thing is Ukraine borders Russia, as I said. And this is going to set the grounds for the conflict that is to happen. Because all these countries have become NATO countries. And if you look at any maps historically, Russia has been invaded when it's invaded from the west, it's invaded this way. When it's invaded from the east, there's no natural boundaries to Russia. The most you can say is there's some natural boundaries down here where there's some mountainous ranges. But generally, that's a clear path into Russia, same from the east. It's a clear path into Russia. And in fact, well, that's the way the German armies moved in World War II. So we could just have at least the front light. Borders Russia is both to its advantage and, if you have your, maybe, is both to its advantage and disadvantage, depending on the political course it sets for itself. It can either be the bridge between Europe and the rest of Eurasia, or it can occupy a position that sets itself against either Europe or Russia, depending on the military and political forces it aligns with. So I think we'll ask you to, do you have a flashlight on? We have to look at what transpired from the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact in the period of 1990 to 1991 to understand why Ukraine became a tipping point in terms of Russia's decision to invade in February 2022. So Germany in 1990, that was East Germany. West Germany, as a condition for reunification, Germany had to leave East Germany had to leave the Warsaw Pact as a condition for reunification. East Germany, interestingly enough, was already part of NATO. Hungary, Poland, and Czech Republic then joined in 1999. Followed by Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. All these countries in 2004. That's the Baltic states. And then finally, the lesser countries, Croatia in 2017, Albania, in 2009, Croatia in 2017, Montenegro in 2020, and 2017 Montenegro down here, and then North Macedonia in 2020. So you have the completion of that first map that I showed you. In September 1990, East Germany left the Warsaw Pact, and it was this action that Russia claims was met with guarantees from the U.S. that NATO would not expand eastward, as Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland indicated they would cease participation in the Warsaw Pact. So, in the immediate period of the breakup of the Soviet Union, you have various forces talking, but Russia says, okay, East Germany will unite, they'll leave the Warsaw Pact, and Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland immediately gave notice that they were leaving the Warsaw Pact. And Russia said, well, if they leave, they leave, but they shouldn't join NATO. By July 1991, the Warsaw Pact was officially dissolved, and by December 25th, 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolved. I gotta see the light up here. The question of NATO expansion through not only what the previous slide said, but they had indicated in talks in the recent various NATO summits that Ukraine was next, followed by Georgia. That's why this map indicates them as being part of an expanded NATO. From the U.S. perspective, Ukraine was the piece missing from its enlargement of NATO to the borders of Russia. It is why Russia set as a red line no admission of Ukraine into NATO as a foundation for its security policy. It was already facing NATO battle groups in Latvia and Estonia, which are on the border as part of 4 NATO northeastern battle groups, the others being Lithuania and Poland, and Canada as part of NATO has responsibility for the Latvian battle group. Now just keep that in mind, because it'll be clear when we talk about the post-Soviet space and what was happening, why this seems so threatening given what kind of other discussions there were. Okay, slide up here. For Russia and Europe within the post-Soviet space, even with a NATO alliance that continued to exist 6 years after its adversary, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, had ceased to exist. So in 1997, Russia and Europe and the US agreed to the Founding Act on Mutual Relations, Cooperation and Security between NATO and the Russian Federation, 1997. It is a long document, but the section that's quoted here is illustrative of its objectives. A very long document, it's worth reading, and you can easily find it by Googling it. It says to carry out the activities and aims provided for by this act and to develop common approaches to European security and to political problems, NATO and Russia will create the NATO-Russia Permanent Joint Council. The central objective of this Permanent Joint Council will be building increasing levels of trust, unity of purpose, habits of consultation, and cooperation between NATO and Russia in order to enhance each other's security and that of all nations in the Euro-Atlantic area. And this quote, I emphasize this in bold, diminish the security of none. And you'll often hear that as being referred to as why Russia sees that they have been dealt from the bottom of the deck in terms of all these negotiations. Because they often refer to this type of agreement. And in fact, almost the whole document just keeps reasserting this. If disagreements arise, NATO and Russia will endeavor to respect NATO and Russia will endeavor to settle them on the basis of goodwill and mutual respect within the framework of political consultation. So all of that disappeared. That all disappeared. Up here. That's 1997, and that kind of rapprochement will bury the last 2 years. In 1999, NATO admitted Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Russia expressed that NATO expansion closer to its borders was a red line. And this is, so this is Western propaganda, this is Radio Free Europe, reporting on what the Russians are saying. Russian Foreign Ministry issued today a statement saying enlargement will not, that's Hungary, Czech Republic, and others, will not promote a strengthening of trust and stability in international relations. Moscow has consistently said that a red line would be crossed if Ukraine or any of the 3 Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were to join the alliance. Foreign Minister Igor Ivanov said in Moscow that the entry of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic is a movement in the wrong direction. He said Russia was interested in a security system that would embrace all of Europe, namely through a new European security charter being discussed under the auspices of the 54-nation Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which has been around for decades, which has been fundamental to peace in Europe. And at the height of the Cold War, the predecessor organization to the OSCE in the 70s and 80s, the predecessor organization, was having all kinds of meetings between the Soviet Union and Europe about stability in Europe. So this is not wishful thinking. There's been actual movements on these things. So by 1999, the handwriting was on the wall with the first expansion of NATO eastward into areas which placed the military alliance of NATO and all its military potential that it represented closer to Russian borders, supposedly in a time of new collaboration between former Cold War adversaries. And at actually in 1991, there was the term peace dividend coined, Do you know who coined that peace dividend, that term? Margaret Thatcher and Bush talked that the fall of the Soviet Union would now mean there'd be a peace dividend. So by 2009, NATO had significantly advanced closer to Russia, and clearly this begins to tilt the balance of power in favor of NATO. So this is the shifting balance of power, and it's moved all the way. So you have all this documentation, you have this work between Russia and Europe about common security. And remember what I read from the Peace Alliance statement by how the results of World War II were squandered. The Cold War ending was squandered. So this is how it's dismissed in Western dialogue. And this is a quote, and we'll get to the document that I pulled from. Commentators have rushed to declare the long criticized policy of NATO expansion as irrelevant to the war's outbreak. This is talking about the Ukraine war. Or as a mere fig leaf used by Russian President Vladimir Putin to mask what Condoleezza Rice and Robert Gates recently called, quote, his messianic mission to, quote, reestablish the Russian Empire. Fiona Hill, a presidential advisor to 2 Republican administrations, has deemed these views merely the product of a Russian information war and psychological operation, resulting in masses of the U.S. public blaming NATO or blaming the U.S. for this outcome. And in fact, there's a Canadian website set up by the, it's either Canadian Foreign Affairs, that says, don't believe anyone who tells you about NATO because it's all just disinformation. And in fact, there's a video clip of Trudeau. Some young man asked him about the question of peace, fairly recently, about peace in Ukraine and what Canada was doing, and about NATO expansion. And Trudeau immediately called him out, saying that he was just falling for Russian propaganda. Thank you. So this is the document it's quoted from. I put the link because it's a very good document. It's a very long document. It's from earlier this year. But in it, he documents extensively, this author, what American officials, not these talking heads that appear like Fiona Hill and these other people, but these are people who are charged with helping to supposedly set U.S. policy. So he says, dozens of diplomatic cables were made publicly via WikiLeaks, show that U.S. officials were aware or were directly told over a span of years that expanding NATO was viewed by Russian officials well beyond Putin as a major threat and provocation, that expanding it to Ukraine was a particularly bright red line for Moscow, that it would inflame and empower hawkish, nationalist parts of the Russian political spectrum, and that it could ultimately lead to war. Recounting his conversations with various Russian observers from both regional and U.S. think tanks, Burns concluded, it's referring to William Burns, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia and is presently the CIA director. Burns concluded in March 2007 cable that NATO enlargement and U.S. missile defense deployments in Europe play to the classic Russian fear of encirclement. Ukraine and Georgia's entry represents an unthinkable predicament for Russia. And then I found this further about what William Burns advised. In 2008, he advised Condoleezza Rice, the person we saw on the previous slide who's just giving some talking points. I've yet to find anyone who views Ukraine and NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. So, can we go back a slide? So where Condoleezza Rice says about this, his messianic mission, her own advisor, her own ambassador is telling her something else. So, And this is a very good document to look up, because all those references where they're saying this and saying that, Burns and others, he has them all hyperlinked to the WikiLeaks documents, so you can judge for yourself whether he's just making up stories or is actually providing true information. So a coup in Kiev, the roots of the war. And I'll just begin by saying it was as much a coup for the interests of others as it was also a coup against the interests of the people of Ukraine. The deliberate eastward advance of NATO, despite intentions to create a new political relationship and security architecture between Russia and Europe, would have undoubtedly have created concern in Russia. In 2013-14, events in Kiev would deepen these political concerns. It was as a coup in Kiev. It was as much a coup against Yanukovych as it was a coup against the people of Ukraine, who, while they had legitimate grievances about corruption, cronyism, oligarchs, and the unresponsiveness of governments to their needs and concerns, which had really been going on since 1991, these were legitimate concerns. In Kiev in late 2013, and just to show you how things get manipulated, it was 2 years ago in Ottawa that you had these people come in to seize the city. In Kiev in 2013, mass protests began against the government headed by Viktor Yanukovych. In February 2014, following violent clashes in Kiev, the government of President Yanukovych was replaced with an interim government. The removal of Yanukovych caused a rupture in Ukraine society along political, social, ethnic, and regional lines, and immediately it triggered events that would lead to internal war. And okay, we'll explain other points later. So this map shows, and this map is from the Brookings Institute, which is an American think tank which Christopher Freeman works with. And it's using The Guardian, British newspaper, and the France press agency. So this is purely a Western-style map, showing where the term Euromaidan is even a term that's coined out of the West. That's to show the links. Where those protests are greatest. This is the west of Ukraine. That's the east of Ukraine. This is the numbers of people involved. So if this map is to be believed, the highest concentrations and the highest numbers of people demonstrating against Yanukovych were in the east. In the west. The lowest numbers were in the east. Oh. Okay, I got it. The role of the United States is well documented. So this is John McCain. And this is quoted from The Guardian. This slide shows John McCain in Kiev at the height of the protest. And this is The Guardian, the British newspaper. Senator John McCain on Sunday told thousands of Ukrainian protesters camped on Kiev's main square that Ukraine's destiny lay in Europe and that it would make Europe better. No one's suggesting otherwise, but why does it have to only be with Europe? I remember what I said, that Ukraine could be a bridge between cultures, between nations. It doesn't have to be one or the other, but this is how the world is divided. Ukraine will make, this is a quote, make Europe better, and Europe will make Ukraine better. He said crowds protesting against President Viktor Yanukovych's U-turn in trade policy away from Europe towards Russia, which is true. Yanukovych decided to go with a Russian trade agreement as opposed to a European agreement. The question could be, so what? Because it's just a trade agreement. It's like Canada deciding to sign a trade agreement with China. So what? Fact is, Canada can't, under the new trade agreement with the U.S., Canada cannot sign a trade agreement with China unless the U.S. approves of it. But at this point, Ukraine had almost 20 years of experience of relationship with Europe. And there's a lot of documentation of the erosion of social programs, the privatization of Ukrainian industries into taking them from public industries into private hands. The emergence of the corruption all began with that, and so on, and the emergence of oligarchs, whether Russian or Ukrainian, all emerged with that. So it's not as if there was suddenly no relationship with Europe. They had had it for 20 years. And Ukrainians had left the country looking for work in Europe because they were too poor in Ukraine. They also had, through those years, trade agreements with Russia where Ukraine was making money off of the shipment of gas to Europe over Ukraine territory. So we are here to support your just cause, the sovereign right of Ukraine to determine its own destiny freely and independently, and the destiny you seek lies in Europe. The reason I emphasize this is you don't tell a people you have the right to choose your destiny and then tell them who it's going to be with. No, you don't. That's why I mean that the Ukrainian people were used. The role of the United States is well documented. There is also the leaked conversation between Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, where they discuss who will lead the interim government after Yanukovych was disposed. It's fine if people want to have revolutions and want to establish their independence, but I've never known of a country that does it with someone else picking who's going to be your leading government. In the Peace Alliance, we had the opportunity in the 20 years ago or so to host Malala Joya as part of a national tour. She was the Afghan MP. And she said, she was asked a question, it was a large public meeting, it was everywhere she went. We had a hall filled with 800 people in Winnipeg. She was asked, well, NATO's bringing your country this and that and this and that. And she says, no one can bring this it's the people themselves in Afghanistan who have to build their country. No one else can build it for us. And she's quite right. Not to mention the fact that Afghanistan had all these things in the 1980s. It had women's rights, it had education, it had social programs, but that was overthrown. Less well known is the role Canada played, allowing protesters, some of them who were from the far right, used the Canadian embassy in Kiev. John Baird was the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, and he visited Maidan Square with Paul Grode, who at that time was president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. And when he was president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, I'll just do an aside, there's the Ukrainian pianist, Vasilina Streltsov. I looked up her name. She's a Ukrainian pianist. She was performing in Canada and elsewhere, and she was deplatformed for her views on Ukraine. Now, she's from the east of Ukraine. Her views were Ukraine should be a republican style of government, a federation, I should say, in which you have, because of the diversity of Ukraine, you have a diversity, you recognize that diversity and you allow people a degree of autonomy within their diversity, not unlike what Canada is like. But the reason I mention that is because he led the campaign in Canada as president of the UCC to deplatform her in Toronto. I think Calgary they attempted to, but she played. But he led the campaign. All for the reason that she said Ukraine should be a federation, and which the people in the trade union building that were burned in 2014, they were saying the same things. So these next two slides, remember the one that showed where the disbursement of demonstrations was in people? This shows the same divisions in Ukraine. This was the 2010 elections. Who voted for Tymoshenko and who voted for Yanukovych. And you can see this east-west split in Ukraine. Because this east-west split, as well as this slide shows those who claim Russian as their unique mother tongue in Ukraine. Again, West Ukraine, the higher proportions being in East Ukraine, obviously the highest, Crimea. But this shows the divisions in Ukraine, because Ukraine is not one monolithic people around one monolithic idea. The regions of Donetsk and Luhansk rejected the interim government as representing a coup, and in their own words said they assumed responsibility for safeguarding the constitutional order, legality, citizens' rights, and their security on our own territories. Now, they voted for the person, and they may say, well, you removed him, and we don't agree with that, which is what they did. In Crimea, which was always an autonomous republic with significant independence within the Ukraine framework, recognized by the Ukraine Constitution, a similar break with the central government occurred. The Ukraine army was dispatched to Donetsk and Luhansk, and it was termed in what was called an anti-terrorist operation. So the people who said, we don't agree with this, were then called terrorists to justify the operation. The civil war that followed was a profound tragedy for Ukraine. It resulted in more than 14,000 dead and more than 1 million people displaced into other regions of Ukraine. There were shortages of food, destruction of civilian structures such as homes, schools, hospitals, civic buildings, and churches. There was, however, a possibility to end the war in Donbass, as that region is called. And had that been happened, the current war would have been averted. This is the Minsk agreement. There are 14 points, but I just pulled out some. So this dealt with the question of ceasefire and removal of weapons. It said there would be immediate and comprehensive ceasefire in those regions. There would be withdrawal of all heavy weapons, and it specified the weapons, the distance, how far they would have to be. Who would withdraw? The Ukrainian troops would withdraw from the line of contact. Armed formations from certain areas, Donetsk and Luhansk regions, would withdraw from the line of contact. The withdrawal of the heavy weapons is specified, was to start, when it was to start. The process would be facilitated by the Organization for the Security and Cooperation in Europe, the organization that was referenced before, and by the Trilateral Contract Group, which was Britain, France, Germany, and Russia. And the withdrawal of all foreign armed formations, military equipment, as well as mercenaries from the territory of Ukraine under monitoring of the OSCE, disarmament of all illegal groups. If anyone had any concern about Russians operating in those regions, this was to address them, it was to be monitored. On top of it all, the Minsk agreements were unanimously adopted by the Security Council of the United Nations. Now, if there was any doubt that Ukraine would now gain control of regions that had separated, or reinstatement of the full control of the state border by the government of Ukraine, and so on, it just describes it. It describes out the carrying out of constitutional reform within Ukraine, entering into force by the end of such a date, 2015, providing for decentralization. So this was to recognize that there was a problem, that people were not being seen in those areas as having control over their lives. And I'll just remind that in Canada, we have an arrangement with Quebec along those lines. Based on the law of Ukraine, on interim local self-government order in certain areas of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, questions related to local elections will be discussed and agreed upon. with the representatives of those areas in the framework of the trilateral contact group, in other words, Russia, Germany, France. The elections will be held in accordance with the relevant OSCE standards and monitored by the OSCE. This could have prevented the war. When it came up, remember I said at the beginning about this meeting that was organized by Liberal MPs with Krista Freeland and Melanie Joly. So you were able to ask questions by submitting them. So I had submitted the questions, what about the Minsk agreements? Because interestingly enough, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress supports the Minsk agreements, or did. And Melanie Joly said, her answer was, yeah, Minsk agreements, and basically she said blah, blah, blah. So that was the attitude of Canada to something that had been ratified by the United Nations unanimously, which means the Security Council, I should say the Security Council, which means all the permanent members the Minsk agreements were supported internationally and were officially adopted by the United Nations Security Council. And as I said, there were 14 measures designed to secure an end to conflict. Now, Zelensky was elected on a platform of peace and ending the corruption endemic to Ukraine. He was prepared to implement the Minsk agreements. This is what he faced. The majority of the majority of the people in Ukraine wanted the war settled. That is in polling done by a Ukrainian organization called the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, which, by the way, is funded by America. Their polling showed that most Ukrainians wanted the war settled. They didn't even care if they left, separated. They wanted the war settled, and they wanted their economy and corruption dealt with. So Zelensky was prepared to implement the Minsk agreements. The majority of the population wanted the civil war ended. Zelensky was opposed by the ultranationalist forces which called for the Minsk agreement capitulation. And this is not just some isolated, this is heavily reported on, the response of these ultranationalists. This is Radio Free Europe reporting on this. Zelensky, who defeated former President Petro Poroshenko in a landslide victory in April, promised Ukrainian voters he would move quickly to end the conflict in the nation's two eastern provinces that has killed more than 13,000 people. Poroshenko on the same day criticized the agreement, saying it would legitimize Russian proxies in the Donbass. The agreement said just the opposite. It said everybody has to leave who's not supposed to be there. After Zelensky's announcement, a group of right-wing groups assembled outside the presidential office building to protest the decision. This is a photo from one of those demonstrations that carried on for weeks. Andrei Belitsky's leader of the far-right National Corps said Zelensky chose shame and now he will get war too. Nationalist Svoboda Party member, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce the name, said Zelensky had, quote unquote, committed treason. And this is not, I had another slide, but I took it out. There are many such quotes from various people saying Zelensky cannot do this. And in fact, there's something that evolves in Ukraine called the non-capitulation movement, which continuously pressures Zelensky to renege on signing the Minsk agreements. So we're now at the end. The urgent requirement is for ceasefire and negotiations, not the false premise that more war will bring peace. This is Jan Stoltenberg in January of this year, and you have to read the quote to believe it. Weapons are in fact the way to peace, said Mr. Stoltenberg, but there's a reason why, and this is the logic. If oppression, there will never be no lasting peace if oppression and tyranny win over freedom and democracy, which is the whole Cold War psychology. It's exactly the same logic in the Hamas-Israel conflict. I think it's openly been said that, hasn't it? He, not by NATO, but by Biden and others. He stressed the need for allies to invest more in defense, eliminate dependencies on authoritarian regimes, and to stand together to uphold freedom and democracy. So when you play this quote and look back to what was done in 1997 with the attempt to create a new security architecture in Europe, you have to ask yourself, well, who's pulling the strings here? Like, who's making things up here? Because there's lots of authoritarian regimes clearly in this world that they get along with perfectly fine. And there was this whole history in Europe. In fact, if you go back and you look at the various Munich summits that were held each year on security in Europe, Europe was turning more to Russia and Eurasia. And Russia had no interest in trying to antagonize Europe. It was doing fine selling raw materials and gas and oil. So why? This position of continuing and escalating the war is widespread amongst Western countries. It is the foundation of Canada's Ukraine policy. Canada and the majority of NATO countries have responded with over 60 billion in military assistance in Ukraine. At over 1.5 billion in military assistance, Canada is the 5th largest contributor, a ranking that places it ahead of most European nations. On the first anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Canada increased its commitments to military support as opposed to finding a path to negotiations and peace. The head of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress endorsed the Canadian government's position, a move which in keeping with the UCC's position on the war in Ukraine and how to end it. In other words, more weapons, more fighting will somehow change the conditions. While the Canadian government, NATO, the US, and European Union, and a section of the Ukrainian community in Canada and internationally see continuation of the war as the preferred option, it is one that is pursued on the backs of the Ukrainian people and the future of Ukraine. The developing situation in Ukraine is reminiscent of the destruction of Yugoslavia in a war that bears striking parallels to the conflict in Ukraine. The refusal to end this conflict continues even though Ukraine has suffered enormous losses of soldiers and equipment on the battlefield. Throughout the summer, it was touted by Zelensky, NATO, and Western governments that a major offensive would turn the situation around. That failed, and with a staggering loss of soldiers and military hardware. The pursuit of war continues with NATO admitting it has little left in the way of ammunition to provide Ukraine. And indeed, as early as last year, Canada was trying to buy military shells from South Korea to make its commitments to Ukraine. The war could have been averted, but was not. When war did break out, there was the possibility to end it within the first few months. Canada has staunchly refused to accept the alternative to war. It did so before any Russian troops entered Ukraine. The entire push was for confrontation. The Deputy Prime Minister spoke at a UCC Toronto rally in the early days of the war and said that she was proud Canada was sending, quote, lethal aid to Ukraine. It has all failed and failed miserably. Ukraine and its people have paid dearly for NATO's gamble. Ukraine was the tool of NATO, the US, and the West in a geopolitical game that stretched over decades. Internally, it was pushed down this path by national and social chauvinism of ultranationalist forces, whose ideological and social roots go back to the Second World War and before. In no small measure, a section of Ukrainian diaspora supported the path of confrontation. The opportunity to prevent this disastrous war was missed. It must end sooner rather than later. Canada needs to support the initiatives to end the war. It must abandon fueling this war with weapons, money, and demagogy. Thank you. Thank you.